Welcome to our third Kirkland and Ellis Sustainable Fireside Chat, a series on innovation in finance, investment, and impact. It is our pleasure to offer this series to the broader Kirkland community to connect and share a moment with our guests who are true leaders in their fields and ESG innovators, and we are grateful for your interest and participation. Our guests are experts who have firsthand experience in how ESG and impact investing is reshaping markets and conventions, who are actively redefining challenges as opportunities, and who are redesigning entire industries to meet future and forthcoming demands. Today's chat will be on the future of low-carbon hydrogen. I am Marcia Hook, a partner in Kirkland's energy regulatory practice. I represent private equity firms, lenders, project developers, and project sponsors in transactional and regulatory matters involving the energy industry. A large portion of my practice relates to energy transition-focused transactions and projects. That is why I'm particularly excited for today's discussion on low-carbon hydrogen, which is widely regarded as a crucial element of the energy transition. Topics for today's discussion will include defining the different types of low-carbon hydrogen and how they differ, current market conditions and influencers of change, scaling in today's market and in the future, commercial opportunities for low-carbon hydrogen deals, projects, and innovation, federal legislative and administrative outlook on low-carbon hydrogen, status of today's low-carbon hydrogen market and outlook for the future, and challenges for executing low-carbon hydrogen strategies and projects. We will take questions at the end of the discussion. Questions during today's discussion can be directed to the webinar's Q&A box, or you can email us during or after the discussion at hydrogen@kirkland.com. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guests. Andrew Marsh is President and CEO of Plug Power, a leading provider of clean hydrogen and zero-emission fuel cell solutions. Under Andy's leadership, Plug Power has been a leading innovator in the alternative energy field, helping create an entirely new hydrogen fuel cell market in the material handling space as the world moves towards electrification in mobility applications. Janice Lin is founder and CEO of Stratogen and founder and president of the Green Hydrogen Coalition. The Green Hydrogen Coalition is an educational nonprofit dedicated to facilitating policies and practices to advance the production and use of green hydrogen in all sectors where it will accelerate the transition to a carbon-free energy system. John Lochner is Vice President of Innovation at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, also known as NYSERDA. NYSERDA works with stakeholders through New York to advance clean energy innovation and investments to combat climate change, improving the health, resiliency, and prosperity of New Yorkers, and delivering benefits equitably to all by, among other things, developing, investing, and fostering conditions that attract private sector capital investment and overcome barriers to using clean energy at scale. Let's jump right into our conversation. Janice, one of the most striking aspects of the hydrogen market is just how colorful the terms are, literally. Blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, gray hydrogen, and the list goes on. Could you get us started by giving an overview of some of these key terms and what folks commonly think of when they refer to low carbon hydrogen?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Marcia. Thank you for having me on today. So the rainbow of colors with hydrogen, there is literally a rainbow. There's even pink hydrogen, yellow hydrogen. I think for our discussion today, one way to think of it is hydrogen historically has been a very mature, traded global commodity. Virtually all of it has been made from fossil fuels. So that's why you hear gray hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from the reformation of natural gas. And brown and black hydrogen could come from oil or coal. And there's the other colors refer to pathways of making hydrogen that's not from fossil fuel feedstocks. But remember, when you create hydrogen, you have to start with a feedstock and you have to supply an energy source. So depending on the feedstock you use and the energy source you use, what will result is some different color of hydrogen. And so the carbon intensity, I'll just give you one example. You can take biogas, which is a renewable feedstock, and reform it with natural gas. And so you'll have one carbon intensity, or you can reform biogas and use biogas, and it'll have a different carbon intensity. Same thing with making hydrogen electrolytically. You start with water, but depending on the carbon intensity of the electricity you use, you'll have different shades of greenness or carbon intensity at the other end. The last thing I wanted to say about this confusing rainbow of colors is it is our belief that in the long run, the renewable pathways will be lowest cost. They're not today, but they will be. And secondly, there is room for all of the above, because when you think about how you make the hydrogen, there's the carbon, the production pathway will have a certain carbon intensity, but remember, the full benefit is predicated on what you do with the hydrogen. So you may be displacing diesel or other fossil fuels. And even if you're using maybe a little bit of fossil fuels and producing the hydrogen to get a lower carbon hydrogen, net, it's still a win for the environment. So I'll pause there.
That's very helpful. And it seems that somewhat commonly, a lot of folks think of green hydrogen, such as hydrogen that's produced from renewable energy, and blue hydrogen, so hydrogen that would be produced from natural gas, but where the emissions are sequestered, as the kind of most commonly referred to low carbon hydrogen. Is that fair to say?
Yes, blue hydrogen is hydrogen made from fossil fuels with carbon sequestration. That's correct.
And Andy, Plug Power focuses particularly in green hydrogen, but many experts project that green hydrogen in particular won't take off for another decade. Yet here we have Plug Power out there actively developing some truly remarkable green hydrogen projects, including a green hydrogen plant in New York that, once constructed, will be North America's largest green hydrogen production facility. What makes Plug Power confident that now is the time to scale hydrogen development?
Sure, thanks, Marcy. A great question. And I would take a step back and say, this is being driven. The market's not being driven just purely on cost. So cost is really important. But consumers want consumers want a low carbon footprint. I work at our two biggest customers, and we've built over 115 hydrogen stations, and by year end, it'll be well over 160 for people like Amazon and Walmart, mostly for use in their distribution centers. And they have net carbon goals of 0 by 2035. And they believe the answer is green hydrogen for the future. And I can tell you that we're working on activities with them, which shows green hydrogen is very competitive. But also government policy is much more geared towards green hydrogen than the other colors. If you think about bills that are being introduced in Congress by Senator Heinrich and others, where there are tax credits for green hydrogen. But the key for green hydrogen, and I think Janice touched on it, is where's the cost of renewable electricity going? And we're seeing that the cost of renewables, especially depending upon where you are versus the meter, which is a real critical item in how we think about building plants. At 3 cents a kilowatt hour, especially for liquid hydrogen, which is really needed in this country for mass usage, that green hydrogen is very, very competitive with gray hydrogen today. On a variable basis, it's about $1.50 a kilogram. And a kilogram of hydrogen is about equivalent to 2 gallons of gasoline. So I think from your audience perspective, we believe green hydrogen is real today. We have a commitment to build out 500 tons of green hydrogen, and that's like by 2025. So that's like 1,000 tons of gasoline production. And it's going to be all across the country. You mentioned New York, where people like the state of New York and John have helped us. You're thinking of places like in California, we own an area for a solar farm. We're looking at hydropower in Pennsylvania with Brookfield. And with Apex, we're building a wind farm with green hydrogen to service the Southeast. And we have a plan to span the whole country by 2025. And one thing I have is customers who want it.
Well, that's great news. And it sounds like such an exciting time to get into the hydrogen space. I guess perhaps this question is for everyone. Could you give us a little bit of an overview, thinking about the US market? Where are we now? Where do you see the market being in 5 years? What about 10 years?
John, you want to take that?
Sure, I'll start. As Andy said, I think there is already a market, and it's quite clear, and it is proven. When we talk to the innovation folks in NYSERDA and DOE, and we think about kind of where the market's going, though, we see a lot of opportunity for continued support to really accelerate. And so the market's growing on its own, but we can do a lot more to get it a lot farther, a lot more quickly, I think, from a government perspective. As Janice mentioned earlier, hydrogen and the use of hydrogen is not a new technology. It goes back 150 plus years. Honolulu is using kind of 10, 12% of hydrogen in its natural gas mix. We have massive storage facilities in the south of the country. There is already an infrastructure out there. There are already stakeholders out there. And as the state, country, and globe try to decarbonize, I think a lot of those pieces are coming together.
Definitely. Go ahead, Marcia.
No, you go ahead, please.
Well, what I wanted to say is that I agree with the other panelists that this market is here now. And I think Plug's early work with forklifts was just genius because, what a value proposition. It stands on its own. But in terms of where we're going to see like really big volumes, our hypothesis is that there is an opportunity to leverage certain sectors that have the ability to scale rapidly at really bulk scale. And then following on the heels of that scaling, cost is going to come down. It'll open the door to many, many other applications. Everything will get easier. And when we think about scaling these initial large and so we spend a lot of time thinking about the power sector. And some of the drivers that are driving the demand and need for hydrogen in the power sector is actually storage. Everybody's heard of batteries. Well, we've used thermal storage for a really long time. But what's new today is that wind and solar are so inexpensive at the margin. There's even PPAs being signed for 2 cents a kilowatt hour. That power is so plentiful and so cheap. And as we get more and more penetration, we're going to have an increasing need to shift large amounts of this very abundant, low-cost, renewable electricity to later times, store it for weeks, months, even seasons, and move the summer production to the winter time. That is a great application for hydrogen and one that is needed and needed very soon in certain areas in the power sector, especially for those areas that do have commitments like Walmart and others to achieving 100% renewable or zero carbon portfolio and to maintain reliability and to keep it affordable. So to answer your question, where we're going to see a big boom in the next 5 years, my prediction is in the power sector, and with an eye towards markets and utilities and municipalities that have very serious goals around 100% renewable energy and who want to keep it affordable.
No, I guess I think that's, when you take a look at work that's been done by people like Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, they suggest long-term that by 2050, hydrogen's anywhere between 18% to 23% of world energy. And it's not just going to happen overnight. There's a ramp to this. And I believe that most of the hydrogen that'll be used in the US and fuel cells between now and 2030 will be more business to business applications. You can make a strong value proposition in transportation for mid and long range trucking just because of the energy density and small size and low weight of fuel cells versus batteries, which is critical in those apps. As DHL's told me, after about 125 kilometers, batteries don't work for a delivery van. And so they say their goal's not to deliver batteries, it's to deliver packages. So I think you're going to see the transportation sector, especially for business applications, take off. I look at the U.S. and, there is, I'm talking about 500 tons of hydrogen. The needs for hydrogen in the U.S. and many of the other applications are 50 to 100 times that. I think you're going to see green hydrogen or blue hydrogen penetrate markets like steel and cement in areas that aren't all that exciting to people, but represent about equal the carbon footprint as transportation. And I think those applications are also going to take off much quicker in the next 4 or 5 years. I think you look at it and say, if people decide, even if they're going to go 5% green on those kind of applications like fertilizer, there's just a huge market there for hydrogen and really helps drive the path long term.
That's really fascinating. So we've touched upon some of the end uses where you think that hydrogen will take off: transportation, in existing industrial uses for hydrogen, power, storage, and generation. Are there any particular regions of the country that you think have unique advantages and might see booms of hydrogen versus other areas?
I would echo one of Janice's comments, which is, cheap renewable energy really is a great driver here, particularly for green hydrogen. And so thinking about the Southwest and the solar resource there, or thinking about the Northwest and Northeast and the large hydro assets. And then, of course, with the offshore wind that a variety of states in the Northeast are planning on, and that I think the federal government is also focused on, that'll open up a whole new range of places where it'll make a lot of sense for hydrogen to grow.
And to build on what John said, I think the other areas where we'll see hydrogen initially take off is where we can very cost effectively store it. Now, we can put hydrogen in pipelines. The United States has 1,600 miles of hydrogen pipeline today. Most of it's in the Gulf Coast. The other place to store it in very large bulk quantities is underground in geologic formations. And this has been commercially done in salt caverns for a very long time. There are several in the Gulf Coast and a really large salt dome formation in the western United States and central Utah. So I think there's some questions still of whether or not you can use other underground storage facilities such as aquifers, retired oil wells, maybe even retired natural gas caverns, and that can broaden the footprint. But remember, it's the transport and the delivery and storage cost, which is a key part of the equation too. We know we can make it cheap at scale with abundant feedstocks and renewable energy sources, but where do you store it to match the hydrogen with that demand, which we know can be kind of lumpy?
I guess I would just say, I think the regions it's going to grow fastest is where policy supports it. Now, if you look at the state of New York, which has an aggressive long-term climate plan, places like California, policy is going to help drive the right behavior. I think that you can't overlook that. The government has a big part to play in how infrastructure rolls out in the coming years. And, I think in certain areas and at a federal level today, I think with the new administration, states, the federal government in those areas where people are sensitive to the climate issues are going to have the opportunities to be both the leaders in jobs and new technology. And this is, the one great thing about hydrogen is it's a job creator. You think about pipelines, labor unions care a lot about the natural gas pipelines. Hydrogen pipelines can help create jobs too and keep those folks working. So I think hydrogen, of all the technologies, helps create nationwide jobs. And I think that'll drive a lot of policy in the country because I think people are recognizing this, globally, People are talking hydrogen eventually reaches 40 million, creates 40 million jobs. And everywhere around the world cares about jobs. And everywhere around the world are trying to marry climate change and jobs together. And the places in the country where people are aggressive about it are going to be the leaders.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Andy. And in fact, I was on a webinar this morning, and that was my closing thought to everybody, is that this isn't a technology play. I mean, we know how to store it. We have above ground caverns, we have pipelines. I mean, you know, there's a solution that's been in commercial use for every part of the value chain for a very long time. What this is about is aligning our goals, our policies, our regulations, and I think the stakeholder who can have the biggest impact near term are our policymakers. And but that's easy to say and harder to do. And I'd like to share, an important initiative that the GHC has launched about 6-7 months ago. It's called the Western Green Hydrogen Initiative. And it's a public-private partnership between the GHC, the National Association of State Energy Officials, and the Western Interstate Energy Board. So this is a collection of 11 Western states, 2 Canadian provinces. They're about as different as you can imagine. I mean, we've got California and Utah, Montana, Nevada, Alaska, British Columbia, Alberta. And what's amazing about this initiative, and it's state-led, so these are the heads of the state energy offices, is that they're all super excited about green hydrogen. They have different reasons. Some it's job creation, others it's economic development, others it's driven by climate, decarbonization. But there's 2 things that they all agree on. 1, this is an important part of our future. And 2, to make progress, we need to collaborate with each other, because the cost-effective solution is necessarily a regional solution that requires infrastructure. And not only do we need to work together, but it's not only a solution for all those big goals, but it's also a very clear solution for this resource adequacy and Western reliability challenge. So they're all thinking of it in the right way, and that kind of state level and regional leadership in combination with federal leadership from Senator Heinrich and the Biden administration, I think will put this country on the map in a way that, for a long time, folks have said Europe's leading, Australia's leading. Well, we're gonna give the rest of the world a run for their money and secure our place where we should be, because we are so blessed in all the factor resources and innovation and leadership. This country should be exporting green hydrogen, just like Chile and Australia and all these other places are envisioning. And as Thierry Leperc, he's one of the founding board members of the GHC, he says green hydrogen is the new oil. And that's really true. And we have a window to catch up. So for all the policymakers that are out there, you guys are gonna make a big difference in, the outcomes in the coming years.
Yeah, as a policymaker, maybe I'll chime in on that one and very much agree. I think we do have a role to play, and Europe, South Korea, others have published these roadmaps a few years back that really lay out how they're going to achieve a hydrogen economy and get those jobs benefits, get the economic development benefits. And California also has some work there. New York State itself is kind of in process right now with its Climate Action Council to develop its plans to decarbonize. And so, coming out of the back of that, we'll have a much clearer perspective on where hydrogen will fit. But I do want to point out, when we talk about what hydrogen could be used for and over what time frame, when we think about holistically decarbonizing the entire economy simultaneously and on a very short time frame, when we're talking about the built environment and infrastructure, we really do need these comprehensive plans that look at holistically the systemic decarbonization. I think it's through those plans that it's quite obvious that electrification can play a lot of roles, but where there are opportunities or questions around cost effectiveness versus hydrogen, and where hydrogen really does look to be a Swiss Army knife in terms of decarbonization across industry, heavy transport, supporting grid resilience and flexibility. And just one other point around, I think the value proposition, I think it's policy, well, perhaps there's a role for all of us to support the education in the US around the value of hydrogen and the opportunity. In speaking with colleagues in Europe, I think there's a clear, broad understanding of where hydrogen fits into a decarbonization roadmap. And in conversations in the US, I'm not sure that understanding is as broad. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to help educate different stakeholders to understand the pros and cons here, and understand that the opportunity, I think, for those jobs and for that economic development. So that's something we think quite a bit about and continue to do quite a bit of research on and outreach for. We ran a deep decarbonization workshop this past November with experts to discuss carbon capture, hydrogen, and some other technologies. And that really kicked off, I think, a process in New York State to help the Climate Action Council and other stakeholders start to really dig into the details around where hydrogen can play a role.
I'm going to disagree just a little with my two colleagues here. I actually think underneath it all, the U.S. is still a leader in hydrogen and fuel cells. I think we've done a lot right when you look at, we probably have more fuel cells deployed than anywhere else in the world. We may not have more hydrogen fueling stations, but I can tell you in California where Janice is, those stations are used more than anywhere else in the world. There is, there has been, I think the question is not whether US is one of the leaders in this technology. I think the DOE's done a wonderful job promoting it. I think the question is, are we going to maintain our leadership? And I think that's where policy is important. And I think the other item that the US policy has done well, and the President Biden administration, many of the bills in Congress are promoting, what made solar and wind work is tax credits and tax programs that encourage a competitive marketplace for these alternative solutions. Now, if you look at some of the Build Back Better plans, you're looking at a 10-year extension of the investment tax credit for all alternative energy. There's bills floating around Congress to support green hydrogen. So in my mind, it's really a combination of the great work John does, but also legislation that creates an environment where the world technologies can compete, where batteries, fuel cells, geothermal power can all compete in the marketplace. You need government guidance and government support, especially for long-term items, but you also need a tax regime that really supports those kind of activities. And the US, quite honestly, has a better tax approach to investment tax credit than I think the Europeans. I think it's they mix that dynamic. So we need John's work, but we also need a tax code that I think really supports the competitive marketplace where I think the US can compete with anyone. I think we're going to win this battle. That's why I'm still working.
I think of it as less of a battle and more as a means to collaborate and share.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. The US has been a leader on so many fronts. The progress on fuel cells, hydrogen fueling, it's nothing short of amazing. I mean, truly, and what you've done, Andy. I think when I was referencing other countries, I would say other countries do have roadmaps to become clear exporters of hydrogen globally. And we have not created that roadmap yet. It's an opportunity for us, and it's something that we could do near term. And the US is blessed in that we have so many domestic uses and the ability to scale production and use right here at home, which is a huge advantage, say, that Japan can't do, right? I mean, they can import and they can use, but they can't necessarily produce. And there are a few, I would say, very key policy decisions, if they were made early on, would put us on a different trajectory on a global basis. And I'll just share a couple. And these are areas that DOE is already working on. So one thing that can get electrolysis jump-started is if we had the ability to inject even a little bit of hydrogen into our existing natural gas system. Is it 2%, 5%, something modest? I realize there are implications for off-takers of the natural, but even that modest amount would be a huge boon, because now electrolysis, you can use the existing gas system as a ready-made, paid-for storage facility almost anywhere in the country. That would be super cool. Another policy, as we start thinking about really large-scale industrial hubs, multi-sectoral offtake opportunities that are going to need millions, hundreds of thousands and millions of kilograms of hydrogen every year, we're going to need a pipeline. I mean, there is just no way that you can move it on road or rail car and make it really cost effective to deliver those kinds of quantities. One thing that Germany is doing right now is they have proposed legislation that's going before the German parliament, I want to say like next month, that says if you have a pipeline and it has historically, transmitted natural gas, when you convert it to hydrogen, and they do have a plan under the European hydrogen backbone strategy, they have a plan to convert their gas system to 100% hydrogen. When you convert it, all your permits still apply, right? Because now it changes the nature of what you're doing. And, without that is a very key piece of legislation that would instantly recognize that our infrastructure, our pipeline infrastructure, is valuable for the green energy economy. And we need to be able to transform it. We don't have that legislation here yet.
Yeah,
I could go on.
I would say certainly, I think that type of legislation is something that New York is looking for its Climate Action Council to really come to terms with in terms of what makes sense. I will say NYSERDA is collaborating on the exact types of studies required to understand the opportunity there and what the ramifications would be for the current infrastructure.
I can also tell you, Janice, there is, because we sell electrolyzers also, Janice, there is lots of interest, especially by smaller rural kind of co-ops in the natural gas industry who are looking at the opportunities and thinking about injecting hydrogen into their pipeline. I do think there's challenges there from a technical point of view. And, I'm not convinced that using, John probably knows more than me because I know Natural Grid in the UK is looking to convert their pipeline to 2040 to all hydrogen. I wonder if in the end an overlay network where the right of way has been established and hydrogen pipelines can be laid over top may be the better approach, because hydrogen is a pretty sneaky molecule. It gets away pretty easy. And that's when I think about it on long term. And by the way, Jazz, I agree with you 100%. It's the pipeline. You had a pipeline that ran down the East Coast. This hydrogen industry would just take off. And, that is, because there is pent up demand, and the cost of transportation with the hydrogen pipeline dramatically changes. I mean, I look at work being done in, Northern Europe where, 600, 700 miles, they're talking about transporting hydrogen for 35 cents a kilogram. In the US, you can multiply that by 7 or 8 times to transport that distance. So pipelines are the key to really bring down the cost of hydrogen.
That's where there's a lot of regulatory work that needs to be done. So when you look at, even the obligation to serve, is it heat, light, and power? Is it gas? How do you define gas? Is it natural gas? It's a real patchwork. And that, you know, that kind of regulatory uncertainty makes it difficult for investors to put big investments into things like new pipelines.
That is something that, you know, it's so interesting to hear you all speak about the different incentives, policy guidance that could be provided at the different levels, federal and state, in order to encourage this industry. For example, you've mentioned tax credits, which historically, for example, incentive tax credits usually occur on a federal basis, but interstate pipeline permitting issues would be, you know, a congressional issue potentially, and could provide a lot of regulatory certainty. Where do you all see the opportunities for state versus federal government? I mean, we've hit on it. It seems like they have different roles. You know, what kind of policies would you want to see at the federal level and at the state level? And John, you have a unique perspective here because you're already deeply enmeshed in these issues.
I have a unique perspective, but I'm also cognizant that there's a organization in the state that is currently discussing these issues and discussing what the appropriate responses are for the state. So I have to be a little bit limited in terms of what I speak about. But, you know, I think we've all talked about this a little bit. It's having those long-term transparent roadmaps which say, this is the role that we see hydrogen playing in a decarbonized economy. It is what I think supports investment from the private sector and supports the organs of government in determining what they need to do to enable the use of hydrogen. So at the federal government, if it's OSHA, if it's FERC, at the state government, it's Department of Transportation, the Department of Environmental Conservation, EPA at the feds, they all need to be assessing rules, regulations, and understanding the hydrogen implications. You know, alongside that, I would say we do see a continued rationale to deploy capital innovation to continue to drive down the green premium. As a friend of mine in the investment business said, it's your job to squash the green premium for me. You know, we've got a lot of proven technology. The more we can scale its deployment, the lower the costs will be, the higher up the experience curve we get, and the faster we accelerate towards a decarbonized future.
You know, I spent a lot of, thanks, John, that's really interesting. I spent a lot of time on federal policy. I'm the chairperson for the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association, which represents over 50 companies in DC, which is working on policy. And today I met with Air Liquide leadership, Toyota leadership, Hyundai leadership, Cummins leadership, and we actually have a real clear federal plan. We're very strong proponents of the extension of the ITC for 10 years at 30%. We believe that will give the industry the takeoff velocity. We're a strong advocate for a production tax credit for green hydrogen at $2 a kilogram, and for other shades a little less. We're a strong advocate. There's a tax code, not to be really specific, but there's a tax code called 30C associated with tax credits for fueling stations, which we won on par with electric stations, because we can move a lot more vehicles in an hour than a battery electric vehicles, especially for heavy duty. And there's tax credits for vehicles that are in place today, which is section 30B of the tax code, not to get too technical, but we'd like to see that extended also so this industry can take off. And so there's strong advocacy going on the Hill, and quite honestly, strong support for this industry that often crosses party lines. The last bill for the investment tax credit for fuel cells, actually the sponsors, there were more Republican sponsors than Democratic sponsors. Some of that was by strategy, but it is not a fuel cell and hydrogen, because I think it is so tied to jobs, is not as partisan of an issue as many other aspects, I'll say, in the alternative energy industry. Unlike John, I have to make a living pumping investors, so I have to say exactly what's going on.
Yeah, that's, I would definitely, you know, we are not as active federally, but all of those policies that Andy mentioned, I think are really, really important I might add to the list the pipeline permitting, especially interstate for the federal list. I'm not sure if you guys are working on that. And then at the state, and also perhaps a point of view on how we define green hydrogen. I mean, it seems like a simple question really, but you know, I'm 4 or 5 months into a pretty in-depth discussion about that at the state level with a whole range of different stakeholders. And it's kind of complicated because there are so many feedstocks and so many pathways to make it, and each with a slightly different emissions implication. So I think federal point of view on that may be helpful because you know, this is going to be discussed at every state level. I think at the state level, there's opportunities to, you know, where states historically have jurisdiction rate setting, right? Both at the gas sector and the electric sector. Should there be a tariff for electrolytic production using clean energy and available capacity from the electric sector to produce hydrogen on a distributed and you know, basis throughout a service territory? If we do come up with an injection tariff, and that's something that probably there's a role federally, and I know DOE is working on that technically, you know, how do you ensure consistency? Because the, you know, the pipelines are all interconnected. So that's another one where there could be a, you know, real close collaboration. And then finally, I think there's opportunities at the state level programmatically. California has had a very successful program for decarbonizing transportation fuels via the low carbon fuel standard. But there are so many other opportunities to encourage the conversion, either from gray to green or switching from fossil fuels to green hydrogen. And I'll give you one example. You know, here in California, we have a goal to have a zero carbon electric sector by 2045. And so far, in most of the modeling that we collectively as a state have done, we're assuming that natural gas is going to be around for those, you know, multi-day periods in the winter when it's kind of cloudy, and those periods when we have low wind. It's like, well, is that really zero carbon? One policy that could be very helpful is to say, you know what, by date certain, we'll have power plants, we need them for reliability, but we're not going to be using fossil fuels anymore. So more restrictions at the point source, for example, or why not existing gray hydrogen uses? Today, you know, oil refineries and ammonia plants, they're the largest users of hydrogen today. Why not set a goal that like, hey, everyone's decarbonizing. We're putting these targets on the transport sector, the electric sector. Why can't these uses be decarbonized by date certain, right? Let's put everybody in lockstep. And those types of market signals and compliance mechanisms can be very effective to encouraging investors to invest, folks like Andy to show up and build a factory here and start developers to start scoping out land use and projects where they can put these facilities. So that's a really, really important role at state level too. And of course, helping to get everything permitted once it's built.
As a regulatory lawyer, speaking to my heart, and you've identified a lot of regulatory challenges that the hydrogen industry faces in the US. Are there any regulatory trends you all are watching outside the US? Do you think that those regulatory developments could inform US regulatory developments?
Well, there's that law in Germany I mentioned. I'm getting it I have a copy of it in German. We're getting it translated now. It's like, wow, this is really interesting. So that is very interesting. And also what the gas TSOs in Europe are doing. I mean, they're like truly committed to converting their backbone, their gas backbone to green hydrogen, which I think is profound and amazing. That one is super duper interesting. I think another one to watch is, you know, there's developments happening around the world where countries are spooling up and preparing their ports and installing the infrastructure to actually move large quantities of hydrogen between countries by ship. maritime ship. So that's an interesting trend that I think we should keep an eye on. So I'll pause there. I'm talking too much.
Yeah, I would say we, as we continue to develop our plans at the state level, are very actively in communication with a number of other countries that have kind of laid out the groundwork for what they believe hydrogen looks like in their future decarbonization plans. And Europe is certainly on that list, South Korea, and others. Europe's made a very conscious decision to use its existing natural gas infrastructure. And it will be, I think, very interesting for us to see what that actually looks like as they move forward with those plans and what works and what doesn't. And in the north, the use of offshore wind to produce hydrogen and how all of that works in terms of system optimization and affordability across the energy sector, I think is also very much of interest to us.
Yeah, and look, as someone selling devices, Europe is a real attractive market, and it does cause you to create jobs there. So Europe has a plan between Europe and Northern Africa to have over 80 gigawatts of electrolyzers deployed by 2030. So it encourages investments, it encourages companies. We have our JV with Renault in France, which will be doing fueling stations as well as vehicles. But we also put a headquarters in Dusseldorf to take advantage of this huge opportunity. And I think I listened to what's going on in Europe. As someone who has to sell products, it makes it very attractive because of the policies that are being developed at the EU level.
And Andy, I had heard in, I can't remember which country it was in Europe, but they also have a policy of taxing diesel for medium and like fleet vehicles, which creates a value proposition now for switching from, your diesel fleet vehicle to a fuel cell fleet vehicle. I think it's in Switzerland.
Yeah. So if you look across the board, I think by 2030, 30 cities will not allow diesel vehicles into the cities in Europe. So I know places, have certain standards of how much emissions per vehicle today. And we know when we deal with customers and, you talk to people like Amazon, we think about places like Madrid and Paris, you're going to have by 2030, zero carbon versions of products that go into the cities. And in many of those applications, hydrogen fuel cells have a strong value proposition. One of the areas which I haven't really thought about is hydrogen in some ways moves the issues of how you bring all this grid power into a city. We know when we talk to some of our internet retail customers who have strong commitments for BEVs in cities, they're really struggling with the electrical aspects of that. And hydrogen and hydrogen pipelines could solve a lot of those issues.
So it sounds like...
But we got a big business today without all this future stuff.
And that's why you're here. It sounds like, the global market is perhaps a little bit ahead of the US market in some regards. And you've said that you all are looking towards other countries to kind of see how things go, for example, with respect to injecting hydrogen into the existing natural gas infrastructure and things like that. Are there any lessons you think we can learn even now with respect to how the US market may develop, or cautionary tales?
Boy, that's John, you want to take, you look like you were going to talk. John, go ahead.
I would just say, anecdotally from talking with policymakers in a variety of different jurisdictions, I think there's been an an initial approach to decarbonization focused on electrification. And as the goal has moved from a minority of decarbonization to full economy decarbonization, there has been a dramatic change, I think, in most plans, and that change has typically moved towards the use of substantially greater amounts of hydrogen as part of the solution. And so I think it's helpful to learn where those policymakers in other jurisdictions, who I think started perhaps with the same priorities as certain parts of the U.S., were forced to pivot and why.
You know, John, I've spent a lot of time in China, and I don't think the Chinese appreciated, if you go back to 2016, they thought it all had to do with fuel cells. They didn't understand the complexity of hydrogen, especially the complexity when you're dealing with fuel cells and the purity level of hydrogen. That, I would present at conferences in China, and I would bring up the challenges of hydrogen and fueling stations. And I think the Chinese thought that was a simple challenge. And I think they found out that you had to think about, and they've done it quite well in the long run, think about things as more of a holistic solution. How do you think about it as a system, not just as pieces? And I think that's one of the differences, I think, between how Europe has really kind of mapped out its roadmap versus how, I think versus how China has done it. And I think there's probably lessons to learn that it's not just one element. I think both of you talked about today. This is a system, and you have to think about it from a system point of view.
Yeah, I want to build on that comment that even looking at the electric sector, that hydrogen is needed here. And because it's this really flexible vector resource, it enables us for the first time to really optimize these two valuable pieces of infrastructure, right? We've got the electric system and the gas pipeline system. And with hydrogen, you can move back and forth in a distributed footprint, in a centralized way. And that is a tremendous opportunity, I think, for ratepayers, for cost savings. We have trillions of dollars wrapped up in both of those systems. Let's use them fully. And, when we think about where those assets are located, and we have like so many assets that are, literally becoming dinosaurs, coal plants, for example, remember that they can be converted and repurposed too. And another amazing aspect about hydrogen is you can bring it, you can take electricity and store it and then bring it back to electricity through a fuel cell, but you can also combust it. And one of the big eye-openers for me, and what got me really excited about hydrogen, was realizing that, just about every gas turbine that we use today for electric generation can handle some amount of blend, anywhere from 5 to 30% with very little modifications. So, so that's where I'm like coming back to the power sector. Talk about repurposing infrastructure. And one of the, if not the largest green hydrogen project under development today is in central Utah. It's a coal plant, an 1,800 megawatt coal plant that's getting converted to an 840 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine that on the first day of its commissioning will combust a blend of natural gas and 30% green hydrogen. And that green hydrogen percentage, and the hydrogen is going to be made, I believe, exclusively from wind and solar, that percentage will grow to 100%. Well, I thought it was by 2045 because the largest off-taker was LADWP, but based on Mayor Garcetti's State of the City speech on Monday, when he said they're going to up their target instead of 2045 to 2035, I think on or before 2035, this plant's going to be combusting 100% hydrogen fuel. And to give you an idea of the volume, at that point, it will require 277 million kilograms per year. I mean, that's just like a huge amount, and enough to help literally scale us, get us down the curve. And what I like to say to policymakers is, what if we had 4 Intermountain power plants? Oh, by the way, Los Angeles does have 4 power plant campuses in LA. But I mean, just imagine that scale. And then what if we did the same thing at our steel plants, at our ammonia factories, or required it at our oil refineries? I mean, well, think of the scale and what's possible. We've done it with solar, we've done it with wind, we've done it with batteries. Hydrogen is just the next thing. And we've largely been talking about electrolysis. And I want to remind people that the other thing that I'm particularly passionate about hydrogen is that you can make hydrogen from waste. So these other issues like landfills and organic waste and ag waste, plastic waste, oh my gosh, like talk about a really huge problem. All of these things can be gasified with very low, very controllable emissions to turn a problem into something that's really useful for society. And that's very, very exciting. So, this little vector resource can do so many things. It's like the super game changer.
Let me just throw one item in, and that'll be my last statement. Everybody wants part of the hydrogen market. Shell Oil wants part of the hydrogen market. There isn't an electric utility in the world. Look at Engie in France. They want part of the hydrogen market. People like Linde, who have traditionally been in this market, want part of the hydrogen market. What's really interesting is, all these segments are combining and focusing on hydrogen, and they recognize it's a huge opportunity. And quite honestly, it puts all their traditional businesses at risk, and that's why they're really looking into this segment. That's why it's a good business opportunities for companies today.
Well, what an inspiring note to end on, thinking about all the opportunities and the excitement around the hydrogen industry. I realize we've come up almost against an hour, so it probably is a prudent time to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Andy, John, and Janice, and thanks so much to all of our listeners that have joined today, clients, friends, and the Kirkland team for joining us. A link to today's discussion will be sent out to all participants in the following days, and highlights will be posted on Kirkland's blog. If you would like to connect with Kirkland on low carbon hydrogen, you are welcome to reach me at my email, marciahook@kirkland.com, or to direct them to our team at hydrogen@kirkland.com. We hope to see you again in the coming weeks for our next upcoming K&E Sustainable Fireside Chat with innovators in finance, investment, and impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Great chatting with you, Andy and John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Great to chat.
Okay. Bye now.
Thank you.